the machine that forced drivers to confront themselves. At first, it felt like any other performance car, impressive, capable, and reassuring in a way that suggested progress had finally made self-doubt unnecessary. But the longer drivers stayed with it, the clearer it became that this machine wasn't interested in flattering anyone, because beneath its composure lived a clarity so sharp that it reflected the driver's mindset back at them without distortion. To understand why this car forced such uncomfortable self-confrontation, we need to return to a moment when technology stopped simply extending human ability and started revealing human habits instead, when machines became precise enough that they could no longer hide indecision, impatience, or ego behind noise or drama. This car didn't shout its intentions. It observed yours. On the surface, everything felt controlled. Steering was accurate. Power was available without effort. Grip felt dependable. That early calm created confidence, but not the kind that comes from mastery. It was a kind that comes from familiarity, from believing that because nothing's gone wrong yet, nothing will. The car allowed that belief to settle quietly, because it didn't challenge drivers immediately. Instead, it waited. As conditions changed, as fatigue crept in, as attention wandered slightly, the car began responding differently, not unpredictably, but honestly, translating every rushed input, every delayed correction, and every moment of distraction into behavior that felt strangely personal. Drivers weren't fighting the car. They were encountering themselves. Those who drove aggressively found the experience tense and exhausting. Those who drove reactively felt constantly behind. Those who tried to dominate the car discovered that domination only amplified their own inconsistencies. But drivers who slowed their thinking, who planned ahead, and who accepted responsibility for each outcome felt something else entirely. The car became calm, predictable, almost cooperative. It wasn't adapting. They were. Instructors noticed that this machine didn't teach through punishment or spectacle, but through reflection, forcing drivers to recognize patterns in their own behavior that other cars had quietly masked for years. It didn't care how fast you were on paper. It cared how you behaved under pressure, and that distinction mattered. Because once a car stops hiding your habits, driving stops being entertainment and starts becoming a conversation you can't avoid. A conversation about patience, about discipline, about honesty. This machine didn't exist to prove anything about itself. It existed to reveal something about the person behind the wheel. And for many drivers, that revelation was far more challenging than any corner or straight ever could be. As time passed, the mirror this machine held up became harder to ignore because repetition stripped away excuses and left only patterns. And patterns reveal far more than isolated mistakes ever could. Drivers began noticing that the same moments of instability appeared again and again, not in the car, but in themselves, surfacing whenever impatience crept in or attention drifted for even a second. This was not a car that punished speed. It punished inconsistency, a rushed entry, a late decision, an unfocused correction. Each one produced the same response every time, making it impossible to blame luck, conditions, or setup. The car behaved identically. The driver did not. That repetition was unsettling. Drivers who prided themselves on experience struggled most because the machine refused to acknowledge past achievements, responding only to what happened in the present moment. Muscle memory without awareness fell apart quickly. Confidence without preparation unraveled. The car revealed how often drivers relied on instinct instead of intention, reacting instead of planning, and assuming instead of observing. Other machines had forgiven those habits quietly. This one amplified them. Track sessions turned introspective. Lap times mattered less than rhythm. Progress depended on mental clarity more than aggression. Drivers who approached each lap with patience found the car settling into a predictable, almost meditative flow, while those who chased performance emotionally felt tension build until mistakes arrived inevitably. The difference was not bravery. It was self-control. What made this especially confronting was how transferable the lesson became. Drivers noticed the same patterns in other areas of life: rushing conversations, forcing outcomes, ignoring early signals. The car wasn't teaching driving alone. It was teaching awareness. Some drivers walked away from the experience frustrated, calling the car dull, unforgiving, or overrated. Others stayed, drawn by the rare honesty of a machine that refused to lie to them, even when the truth was uncomfortable. This wasn't a car you could conquer. It was a car you had to understand. And understanding required something many drivers had never practiced seriously: listening. Because once a machine reflects your behavior without distortion, the only way forward is to change what you bring into it. And that realization was pushing the story toward its most difficult moment yet. The turning point arrived quietly, not as a dramatic loss of control or a public failure, but as an internal shift that many drivers struggled to articulate, because the machine had stopped feeling like something to be mastered and started feeling like something that demanded accountability. After enough time behind the wheel, it became impossible to pretend that the car was a variable, because every outcome traced back with uncomfortable clarity to choices made seconds earlier, moments earlier, habits formed long before the drive even began. Drivers realized they could no longer outrun their own patterns. Aggression produced tension. Distraction produced instability. Ego produced inconsistency. And none of it was random. The car responded with such repeatable honesty that it stripped away the emotional drama drivers often attach to mistakes, replacing frustration with clarity that was almost clinical. If the car unsettled, there was a reason. If it flowed, there was discipline behind it. Nothing was hidden, softened, or excused. This forced drivers into an unfamiliar position. They had to slow down mentally before they could go faster physically. Those who stayed with the car began developing rituals that had nothing to do with machinery and everything to do with mindset. They prepared mentally before drives. They learned to reset after mistakes instead of chasing recovery. They treated attention as a resource rather than a reflex. The car rewarded that shift immediately. Laps became smoother without trying to be faster. Mistakes decreased without forcing correction. Confidence grew, but this time was quiet, grounded, and resilient. What surprised many was how emotionally demanding this process was. Letting go of ego felt like loss at first, because identity had been built around being fast or talented. This car asked a different question. Are you present? For some, the answer was uncomfortable enough that they walk away, preferring machines that distracted, entertained, or reassured instead of reflected. For others, the experience became addictive, because once you accept responsibility fully, progress feels honest in a way no shortcut can replicate. The car had transformed from performance object into psychological instrument. It didn't judge. It didn't punish. It simply refused to lie. And by refusing to lie, it forced drivers to confront the one thing they could never outsource to technology: themselves. That confrontation would define whether this machine became a footnote or a lifelong reference point. Because once you experience a car that reflects your behavior this clearly, you can never fully return to machines that let you hide. And that is where the story reached its deepest tension. The final lesson this machine delivered was not about driving faster, braking later, or pushing harder, but about the quiet responsibility that emerges when excuses are no longer available and outcomes can no longer be outsourced to technology, conditions, or chance. It showed that mastery is not loud, not dramatic, and not proven in a moment of bravado, but revealed slowly through consistency, awareness, and a willingness to accept discomfort without deflection. This car did not demand perfection. It demanded presence. Once drivers accepted that, something changed fundamentally. The tension dissolved. The struggle softened. Driving became less about winning an argument with the road and more about participating in a dialogue with it. The machine no longer felt confrontational. It felt honest. And honesty, when sustained, becomes trust. Drivers who learned this lesson carried it far beyond this car. They became calmer in faster machines, more patient in forgiving ones, more attentive in everyday driving. Because once you've been forced to confront your own habits without filters, you stop mistaking confidence for control everywhere else. This is why the car still matters long after newer technologies have promised easier paths to performance. It represents a philosophy that refuses shortcuts, insisting that improvement comes from self-awareness rather than assistance, and that responsibility cannot be softened without being weakened. The industry rarely celebrates machines like this. They are too demanding, too revealing, too honest. But for those who experience it fully, this car became more than a reference. It became a standard, a reminder that the most challenging machines are not the ones that test our reflexes, but the ones that test our character. Because when a car forces you to confront yourself, What you learn doesn't stay on the road. It stays with you. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The machine